I feel like a locomotive, sipping, drinking Arizona. Mixtape just around the corner, did a lot in California. Can't wait to drop this on you. Yeah, they gon' have fun with that. Smash like Songa, man, my songs gon' break through like a running back.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. It is Thursday, October 13th, 2022. Mark Daly, Mark Hamilton here. And dude, what's wrong? Are you okay? Like for the longest time, every time that we open with JT the human, I'm watching you bust a move here in the studio. And today it was just kind of like some subtle kind of like head bobbing. It's like, oh, that's cool. But you look happy. That's the main thing. How's your week been?
I'm fired up for this podcast. And to backtrack, you and I sat down last Thursday. We did a podcast. It felt good. Like it felt like we kind of had the chemistry back. We were vibing. It felt really good. On Sunday, it was actually Canadian Thanksgiving. So you took the day to spend with your family, and I ended up doing a podcast with Tim, which I thought was really good. And it was funny because when I was talking to Tim on Sunday, I'm like, hey, dude, there's this possibility that could be some news tomorrow about cost cap compliance. If there is, and there's a interesting wrinkle to it, like, do you want to jump on a late night reaction podcast with me and Daly? But as it turns out, I did my Thanksgiving on Monday midday, and you guys ended up recording a great reaction podcast. And I can't wait to get into this with you. But yeah, pretty fired up. So this is our fourth podcast, I think, in the last 7 days. So we've been busy. The driver's title might be wrapped up, but we've still got tons to talk about over the next couple of months.
Oh, I know, right? I mean, that's the one nice thing about Formula One, that even though there may or may not be action on the track, there's always something to talk about. And then when you get into like deepest, darkest winter, at least in the northern hemisphere, in the off season, and everything is well and truly shut down, there's plenty of there's decades of material to go back and dive into, and we're certainly going to do that once the season comes to end in about 6 or 7 weeks from now. But I don't want to put the cart before the horse, because even though we got 5 races to go, it's still fun to watch, and it's I don't know, Formula One always helps me with my Jones. And you know what? But it's funny. I was just thinking about how you were kind of like having, I wouldn't say regrets, but you just felt like a little bit like, oh, they're doing a pod on Monday. I felt the same way on Sunday. The way that our the times of our dinner kind of like got moved around during the day, and then it was funny though, the way that Japanese Grand Prix kind of went off. I was so excited because number one, I love Japan. Number two, I love the Japanese Grand Prix. I love Suzuka. I think it's a classic, fantastic track that just has so many different elements to it that makes it such a unique circuit and such a challenge for the drivers. And then thirdly, it was supposed to start at a really friendly time here on the West Coast, which was 10 p.m. Pacific. And I was like, this is great, because I'm a night owl anyways. I mean, 10 p.m. on a Saturday night, I'm going to be up for hours still. I mean, I don't go to sleep until the wee hours of the morning. So I was really, really excited about that. And I must admit that just the sort of on again, off again nature with the weather and everything like that, I found myself nodding off, and it was a bit of a struggle to get through that restart. But it is what it is, and ultimately, it's kind of funny. I think what happened on the track and what the results of that Grand Prix has been completely overshadowed. But what came afterwards on what was Thanksgiving Monday, I guess Red Bull and Aston Martin weren't too thankful for that news dropping. But I am kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit. Before we do that, first of all, we want to wish a happy 79th birthday to Mr. Peter Sauber. And if you haven't been around Formula One for that long, Sauber is basically Alfa Romeo. Alfa Romeo's basically got some really fancy naming sponsorship deal with the Sauber group. And Sauber's been around for a very long time in Formula One and motorsport in general. And I didn't realize that Peter was actually that old. I would have thought he was like in his 70s, but I didn't think he was pushing 80. But happy birthday to Peter Sauber nonetheless. And I guess we'll give as usual, we'll give a shout out to our good friends at the Race Weekend, theraceweekend.com. That is THERC, what is it? RCWKND, Race Weekend. Oh, sorry, no, it's RACEWKND.com. Go over there, enter our promo code Scuderia Pod, and you'll get 10% off. A fantastic publication. and you got your arms crossed. So I'm just going to go straight into the drivers and constructors championship update, because every time I do this, you tell me you're not ready, unless you're ready.
I'm
I mean, you're
ready.
you're,
I'm
you're
ready.
great.
I'm
Okay,
ready.
I
Yeah.
kind of had a feeling, because the way you're smiling, I was just like, I'm gonna breeze right by it, but you're not gonna let me. So
Oh,
what you had
there's
in
so much activity in the top 10 in the Scuderia F1 podcast Super League this week. So, number one, sitting number one from the UK, Whitman R with 3,719 points. That is F. Number two, 3,705. Also from the UK, Andrew T, number three, 3,703 points. Number four, Janko West, representing the Great White North, 3,652 points. Number five, Aaron K. Aaron just keeps inching up the standings at 3,621 points. Number six, Marshall W from the UK, 3,583 points. Number seven, Adam J, also from Canada, 3,568 points. Number eight, Daffy A from the UK, 3,563 points. Number nine, new to the top 10, I think, Radek W, 3,528 points. And number 10, this is a definite, oh my goodness. So this is how old I am. I actually need to zoom in here because my eyes aren't great. Hold on. And this is like the longest drum roll ever. Number 10, Merck Stappen has slid into number 10, into the 10 spot at 3,499 points. So probably the most activity we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
Very
Can't really
cool.
speak to why, but it just means that this championship is still wide open.
There we go. We're going to have like a fantasy league show just dedicated to all these fantastic fantasy league players. And if things get a little bit uninteresting on the track, but we know that there's going to be something to talk about. And I'm sure there's going to be lots to talk about over the next 5 or 6 weeks as we wrap up this championship in 2022. Okay, over to the driver's standing. Max Verstappen has now been crowned champion. The Red Bull driver, 366 points. Sergio Perez, his teammate, now in second in the Drivers' Championship with 253, a single point ahead of Charles Leclerc from Ferrari with 252. George Russell for Mercedes, 207, just 5 points ahead of Carlos Sainz, the second Ferrari driver, 202. Lewis Hamilton in sixth spot. Not used to seeing Lewis that far down in the championship. He has 180 points. And boy, I mean, the season got off to a pretty rough start for Lewis. He just hasn't been able to really take any big leaps and bounds to move up the standings in the drivers' championship. So definitely not used to seeing Lewis Hamilton that far down. Anyways, over in the constructors' championship, Red Bull still blazing the way, 619 points with 5 races to go. Ferrari 454, Mercedes 387, Alpine with 143, McLaren losing a bit of ground to their French rivals. They have 130 points. Then just running down the rest of the constructors, Alfa Romeo, Aston Martin, Haas, AlphaTauri, and then Williams is 10th in the constructors championship, and the only team that hasn't broken into double digit points in the constructors this year. They only have 8. So there you go. And then let's jump into the latest fun graphic of the week. Let's zoom into that because I made it a little bit too small. So this comes from at F1 Stats Guru. So the biggest points deficit overturned en route to becoming the drivers' champion since 2010. So 2022, Max Verstappen was 46 points behind. So that's Charles Leclerc. And then 2012, Sebastian Vettel overturned a 44-point deficit from Fernando Alonso. In 2010, Seb overturned a 31-point deficit that was established by Lewis Hamilton. In 2014, Lewis Hamilton, who was champion that year, overturned a 29 deficit that was in the favor of his former teammate Nico Rosberg. And then in 2017, Lewis overturned a 25-point advantage that Sebastian Vettel had. And well, as we know, Lewis has basically owned the world championship since 2014. So some interesting names in there. And it's interesting how Seb and Lewis popped up twice in both of those runs, because you remember Sebastian was world champion from 2010 to 2013, 4 times in a row. Lewis has been champion 6 times since 2014. But interesting that they both overturned some pretty hefty points deficits. But I mean, Seb overturning 44 points to beat Fernando Alonso. That seems like a while ago. I must admit, I struggled to remember that season a little bit, Mark.
Yeah, it's funny because while you were talking, it kind of occurred to me that 2010 was a pretty close championship. So I
Yep.
just brought it up on Wikipedia here. Here's how the final drivers championship finished up or tied it up. Sebastian Vettel, as you mentioned, won the title. He finished with 2000, sorry, 2000. He finished with, hold on, again, my eyes are letting me down here. But in 2010, Sebastian Vettel won the Drivers' Championship with 256 points. Number two was Fernando Alonso at 252 points. Number three was Mark Webber with 242 points. And Lewis Hamilton finished with 240 points. You had four drivers within 16 points of each other in that championship. You forget how wild and how tight the championship was that year. Just incredible. And
Mhm.
I always think about, Lewis's great years. 2007, he was so close. In 2008, he was so close. And 2013 was something of a resurgence in that V8 Mercedes. And then 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. It was the Lewis Hamilton show. But he was just 16 points shy of a championship in 2010. And what really impacted him there that year was he had that string of really bad luck with that retirement in Hungary, at Monza, in Singapore. And if not for that string of bad luck, he could very well have an additional championship from 2010. And you could always play the what if game, but yeah, just
Sure.
remarkable how close that 2010 championship was. And to your point, Sebastian Vettel had to dig himself out of a huge deficit to go on and win his first title.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of very similar to the way that Nico Rosberg won his first title, right? His one and only title in 2016, because he got off to a pretty good start that year, and then Lewis struggled a little bit. He sputtered through the first several races, and Nico had something like a 43 or 45 point lead in the championship by the time I think we got to China, or by
Yeah.
the time we left China. And Lewis did a really good job to really claw it back. But I mean, after that, his engine let go in Malaysia, it was pretty clear that he dropped all those points in that race, and from there, Nico was just going to play it clean and just nurse that championship home. And I mean, we still kind of remember that season finale at Yas Marina, and remember how you had like Sebastian Vettel and Max Verstappen, and Lewis was trying to back Nico into them, and it was just hoping that they
I
would kind of
loved
like
it.
wait into that, and you could tell that Max and Seb, they just didn't want to get involved. You got Patty Lowe on the radio telling Lewis to speed
Yeah.
up and all these. That was kind of
Lewis,
pretty
this is
pretty dramatic.
Patty. Lewis,
Yes.
yeah, I'll never forget that. And like I've said before, the funny thing is, we
Mm,
were there, but we obviously didn't have access to the race commentary, so it
yeah.
wasn't that clear to us that all of that was happening. And it really wasn't until we actually got back home and we rewatched the race that a lot of those kind of, I would say, layers of complexity dawned upon us. But yeah, what an interesting finale that was to a bitterly contested championship between two bitter rivals on the same team.
Dude, I'll be completely honest with you. If I'm going to a Grand Prix anytime soon, I'm taking my phone. I'm making sure that I've got like a data plan if there's no Wi-Fi at the
Yeah.
track,
Yeah.
and I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
engaging the AirPods so I can, turn on F1 TV Pro and get on the comms of, Lewis or whoever it might be, whoever, just to throughout the race, because that would have been that would have been pretty fun to be able to toggle back between the race radio and listen to what all the drivers were saying. Okay, so pole to wins ratio for drivers that are still active. So Max has converted 72.22% of his pole positions into victories. That is quite a bit more than the number two driver, which is Fernando Alonso, who has converted 63.64% of his poles into wins. Lewis has converted 59.22% of poles to wins. Sebastian 54.39%. Carlos Sainz, 50%. Danny Ricciardo, 33.33%. Valtteri Bottas, 30%, pardon me, of poles to victories. And then Charles Leclerc, 22.22% of poles into wins. And I mean, there's some pretty impressive numbers in there. I mean, if you look at Lewis and Fernando and Sebastian, I mean, how many races have those guys competed in combined? I mean, it must be pushing like 1,000 Grand Prix between those three drivers. I mean, Lewis has been around for a long time. Seb's been around for a long time. I think Fernando's been racing since at least 1849. So, I mean, just by virtue, when they're still racing with horse and carriage or whatever it was. But those are impressive numbers for Sebastian Lewis and Fernando Alonso. Like anything north of 50%. But I mean, especially with drivers that have been around for that long, and of course, that's not percentage of race starts to victories, but just poles to victories. I mean, we have to bring that the exact numbers. I mean, Lewis, of course, is the all-time leader when it comes to poles set. I mean, he eclipsed that. What was that in 2017, 2018? He did that in Montreal when he remember when he did that, and it just keeps on going. So per the potential that Lewis and Fernando could extend those streaks is still possible. Probably more likely that Lewis will rather than Fernando, but I guess we shouldn't write Fernando Alonso off considering we don't know what Aston Martin's challenger for next year will look like. But that's kind of a cool stat. So let's get back into where we kind of left it off, or at least where Tim and I left it off on Monday. And that is the discussion about the overspends that were announced by the FIA on Monday, a procedural breach by Aston Martin, and a minor overspend by Red Bull. And of course, this has really ignited a lot of debate. You've had Toto Wolff, team principal of Mercedes, saying that there's nothing minor about a minor overspend breach. Martin Brundle, former Formula One driver and Sky Sports commentator and F1 pundit, said that the FIA punishment must hurt. That's his exact term. And, as I said with Tim on Monday, that I think this is a very important situation for FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem, because, I mean, he's really only been on the job for about a year-ish now. It hasn't been all that long. And it's really going to set the precedent and the tone of his presidency, but also it's going to set the tone and the precedent for this whole cost cap, because if they don't come down with what is an adequate punishment or a retribution, it just sounds a little bit kind of nasty, but you know what I mean. Whatever the reprimand is, it has to be matching to the transgression. So I agree with Toto Wolff. I mean, there's nothing minor about a minor overspend. I mean, you have that hard cost cap. You're not supposed to go over it, but I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I mean, you have to think that Christian Horner really legitimately 100% believed that they were in compliance with the cost cap. Otherwise, he would have been out there threatening legal action against those that were bad mouthing them in the press and saying that he was in on all the discussions and the procedure, that they'd hired one of the big three accounting firms in the world to handle this thing. So I'm still inclined to take him at face value until let them proven otherwise. I'm just surprised that a team like Red Bull, would find themselves in this position, because like I say, they engaged like an external party to basically ensure their compliance with it, and yet they've still run afoul. So it would be interesting to see what any forensic back accounting or whatever you want to call it reveals, and whether or not any details will be released by the FIA in the future. Because I think everybody wants to know is, okay, they did it, but how did they do it? Was it purely an accident? Of course, I think the tendency for most people is just to jump at, oh, they did it on purpose. But as I said with Tim, I mean, I can see internally, and I'm not referring, I don't want to say anything negative or bad about Red Bull, but just in general, if you have like a group of people that want to deceive a people, I can see that within an organization, when you have like another external organization, especially with that company that employs professionals that are bound by their own code of ethics, I find it more difficult to believe that you could kind of rope in an external body like that into a conspiracy. Not saying that that's the case that we're seeing now, but I'm skeptical of an intentional overspend at this point. Let's just put it that way.
First of all, shout out to both you and Tim. Like I said earlier, I listened to that podcast earlier today when I was getting ready to go out, and I was getting dressed, and I appreciated a couple of things about your effort. And I think one of them was that there was no sense of, I would say, emotional bias. And so much of what
Mhm.
I've heard in the media and what I've heard on other podcasts and what I've heard on Twitter and Reddit has been this really bias laced mentality, which is, if this was Mercedes, they would have been they would have been disqualified from the championship. And if it was Ferrari, they would have been fined into oblivion. And it's all these weird weird statements that just reinforce and illustrate people's biases within the I would say, ecosystem of Formula One. And that's a little bit disheartening. I think before I share my thoughts, because I definitely have some, and there were some comments that both you and Tim made that I do certainly disagree with, and I'll share those. But we had a couple people reach out over the,
Oh
we
my
actually
God.
disagreed on something, man. But I had a couple people reach out and then just like, hey, can
Sure.
you remind everybody what the cost cap is? So
Yep.
Liberty has done some really great things for Formula One since it purchased the sport 4 or 5 years ago, I guess 5 or 6 years ago at this point. And again, they basically got the sport for a song. They really didn't pay
Mhm.
much for the sport. I know what the price tag was declared as being, but there was some real financial and accounting wizardry that helped them purchase this sport for a song. But one of the things that they promised to do was create more competitive parity. And they were able to do that with the 2020 Concord Agreement. And one of the ways and one of the things that's so special about that Concord Agreement is that they got all of the teams to agree on a couple transformational changes to the sport. And for the sake of this
Mhm.
conversation, the biggest one was the cost cap. And the intention of the cost cap is to equalize the spending amongst all of the teams, because historically you could have a Red Bull, a Ferrari, or Mercedes. And I say those teams because those are some of the historically bigger spenders that could spend an unlimited amount of money developing their car on their operations. And unfortunately, not all of the teams on the grid had that financial capability or have that financial capability today. So what that determined was that before the jump, before winter testing, you already knew who the top three teams were going to be simply because they outspent everybody by a significant margin. So you had small teams that maybe spent 60 or 70 million dollars, and you had a Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes spending 300, 400, $500 million. That is not a championship. That is not compelling to watch. So one of the things that Liberty was able to do was convince, not strong arm, but convince the bigger teams that this idea of cost cap is a good thing. And if I'm Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, I'm like, well, I spend a lot of money and I have a lot of success. If I'm spending less money and the smaller teams are spending an equivalent amount of money, my competitive edge may be diminished. But the way that Liberty was able to convince these teams to pursue this concept of a cost cap was by reminding them that, hey, if there is cost certainty in the sport, for instance, if it's known that the maximum amount of money that you're going to be able to spend in a year is $150 million, that helps to significantly enhance the value of these operations, because you don't have to spend $500 million a year to be competitive. You only have to spend $135 million and just surround your organization with great people. And then the question often comes from that, and we might actually get to this a little bit later, that if as an organization we have an income of $500 million, so that's prize money and that sponsorship money, but we're only spending $150 million on the budget cap and say $50 million in driver salaries and some other miscellaneous expenses, that's $300 million in profit. So that's $300 million in profit that we get to keep as an organization. And that's also going to drive the valuation of the team through the roof, because this is a team now that gets to compete in Formula One and earn $300 million a year. So kind of pivoting back now, or drifting back, or taking a sharp turn back to the conversation at hand, my biggest concern here is not necessarily the rules themselves, because let's be honest, we're all now shocked and surprised at how ambiguous and how terrible the rule set is in the financial regulations. But they've been printed and published for months or years. It shouldn't be a surprise to us now that if I look at them and I look at a minor sporting penalty and there's a list of 117 different possible penalties without any clear direction on how or when each of those would be applied, and the fact that a minor overspend is between $1 and $7.25 million, none of us should be angry or surprised. The reality is they've been set in stone for some time. And the other thing I want to be clear about here, and I am not an advocate or a fan of the FIA, ultimately the financial regulations, the cost cap, this was all agreed upon by Liberty, the FIA, and the teams. Everybody signed up for this, and it's terrible, but we all signed up for this. So we shouldn't suddenly be getting angry that, well, ultimately the penalties, like the minor sporting penalty or a material sporting penalty, they're super ambiguous. And who's the one that's ultimately going to make the decision? And how is it that Red Bull could spend $7.25 million over the cap and get nothing more than a public reprimand? Well, again, everybody agreed to these penalties. Everyone agreed to these regulations. And if the teams don't like them, they have the opportunity to go back and rework them with the FIA and Liberty, but they are what they are. I think it's
Hmm.
now abundantly clear. I think it's abundantly clear that the reason, and you and I were super excited because we thought we were going to talk about this last Thursday. The reason, obviously, that the FIA at the very, very, very last minute moved the distribution of the cost cap compliance certificates from last Wednesday until Monday of this week was because they obviously knew what the outcome was going to be. And I don't think they wanted to go into a Grand Prix weekend and have this huge cloud hanging over the head of the team that was about to or did win the World Drivers' Championship, right? So they come out on Monday and they distribute the cost cap compliance certificates. And obviously, a shock to nobody, Red Bull spent too much money. Now, the challenge is
Hmm.
we don't know how much money they spent over the cap. But that said, I also don't believe that's relevant because to me, whether it's $1 over or whether it's $7.25 million over, which would be that 5% buffer because the minor spend is that the cost cap plus 5%, it's absurd. Whether it's Red Bull, whether it's Mercedes, no matter who it is, if you spend $1 over, you've broken that regulation. Now, the
Yep.
challenge is, like I said, if you look at a minor sporting penalty and I have the financial regulations right in front of me, here is what could be applied. Any or none of these. One, a public reprimand, which is nothing more than a printed statement saying, slap on the wrist, you overspent, don't do it again. A deduction of constructors' points, a deduction of drivers' championship points, suspension from one or more stages of a competition, limitations on ability to conduct aerodynamic or other testing, and or a reduction of the cost cap. There's a lot here, but it's not clear on when or how any of this would be applied. I,
Hmm.
like you, I don't subscribe to that conspiracy theory that Red Bull intentionally overspent, that they were pushing the boundaries of the regulations. I don't believe that. And you and I have talked about this. The teams do that with the technical regulations all the time. It's just the way the sport works. I don't believe Red Bull, with all of their worldly financial resources and experts and accountants and finance geniuses, I don't believe that they would have tried to intentionally overspend and cover it up. That said, I think the financial regulations and the cost cap are so critical to the financial and competitive health and the future of this sport that the FIA needs to come down like a hammer on Red Bull or any team. Any team. This is the first year, 2021, the first year that we've had the cost cap in place, and we had a team that's breached it. Why? How much? Again, we don't know. And why they haven't already announced a punishment or why Red Bull hasn't engaged in an ABA construct, I don't know. But my point being that regardless of who it is, you have to make it extraordinarily clear from the jump that there is
Yep.
absolutely zero tolerance. Now, that said, I think the financial regulations need to be reworked because they're still too ambiguous. It needs to be crystal clear. There's no major overspend, there's no minor overspend. It's just, did you comply with the cap? Yes or no? And if you didn't, whether it was $1 or $100 million, the punishment is this: you are disqualified from the championship. And again, I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I also don't think that that's
Yep.
necessarily unfair. So I'm frustrated with the situation because I'm frustrated now that we are going to be sitting for weeks or months with an unclear understanding of how much did they overspend by? Will that have an impact on what the final outcome, the punishment will be? Is this going to go to court? How long is this going to drag out? All of this is just going to continue to fuel the conspiracy theory of Red Bull fans versus Lewis fans and Lewis fans versus Red Bull fans and all of that nonsense that hasn't kind of tamed down since last year. But I don't think this is a great situation. And one last point before I pass it over to you, because I see somebody in the live chat throwing this at us right now. But here's the list of what does come under the cost cap. So every part of the car, from the steering wheel to the wheel nuts, all of the elements needed to run the car, most of the team personnel, garage equipment, spares, transport costs, and everything in between. And what's not included is the driver salaries, so they're excluded from the cap, the wages of the 3 highest paid staff members, travel costs, marketing spend, property and legal costs, entry and license fees, any non F1 or road car activities. So, for instance, if I'm McLaren, every single cost associated with the McLaren road car division will be excluded from this. Parental and sick leave payments, employee bonus and staff medical benefits, and engines. There's an entirely different set of regulations that cover the engine. So, my friend, I think I'm in agreement with you that I don't believe Red Bull had any malicious intent. But that
Hmm.
said, and I know Tim made this comment that, well, the penalty can't be too heavy and it can't be too light. I certainly agree that it can't be too light, but I also disagree that it can't be too heavy. I think even a disqualification from the championship is apt if they spent over, because the FIA needs to set the message right now and be crystal clear that if we're going to have a cost cap, this is the outcome. It's not going to be that because, one, they can't be disqualified based on the mining sporting rights penalty. But two, yeah, anyways, I'm going to pass it back to you because I'm ranting a little bit. But my friend, your thoughts, you've had a couple of days to stew on this since you did that great podcast with Tim. Has your position evolved? Has it changed?
It's kind of evolved a little bit. Like where I kind of left it was, and I still, this is the way that I would kind of like to see it go. Is we find out how much they overspent by. Say it's $5 million, right? You take that, you reduce you double that amount, and you deduct it from their cost cap from next year, because Mattia Bonotto was saying that $5 million is equivalent to approximately a half a second advantage on the track. So I mean, but if you double that, then you're basically handicapping what they can do. But then also hit them in another way financially. Deduct constructor standing or championship points from them from last year. So maybe that affects like the amount of payout that they get, or I don't know. I mean, I think it should be financial at this point. I mean, I really don't know. Like, how do you retroactively suspend or exclude somebody from a championship that's already decided? Because I've kind of been thinking about it too. I mean, last year was contentious enough the way that championship ended, and I'm not really in favor of penalizing the drivers. Like, it just happens to be Max Verstappen, but it could be any one of the 20 drivers on the grid. To me, this is like a team penalty, right? Even though it comes down to the accounting, it's not the way the car was designed. It's not something that they did in the garage. It's not something that the driver did, like to intentionally gain an advantage on the track. This to me is like a team hit. You go racing as a team, regardless if you have like one driver in the car, one person is driving the car. You race as a team. It takes an army, a literal army of people to design, build, transport, and race these cars and service them, and everything that goes with them. So whatever the penalty is, I think it should apply to the team as a whole, but I think it should be financial, and I think it should apply in a meaningful way. Like, also, I like the idea of limited wind tunnel and CFD, modeling and all that sort of stuff. It's something really tangible, something that's going to affect the car for next year, or maybe it limits the amount of upgrades that they can design and develop during the course of the season. Something that's tangible, that we're not 3 races into the season. It's like, oh yeah, well, we had a penalty, but we've already overcome it, and we're off to the races now. Rest of Formula One, look out, here we come. I think that whatever the punishment is, it should be harsh enough that they deal with it from the very first race of the year in 2023 right to the very end, and that it's not easily, or I would say anything in Formula One is easily overcome. But let's just say that they're not able to find some way to engineer themselves out of the problem during the course of the year, because then, like you say, that then the whole thing becomes a bit of a farce. It's got no teeth to it, and what's the real deterrent to anybody else from doing it in the future?
The challenge, I think, with what you're saying, and I totally get it, and I don't think you're right. I don't think you're wrong. I'm not right. I'm not wrong. We're just having a conversation. But
Sure. Yep.
if we were to make this financial, and we were to
Yep.
take let's say we took 250 points off of Red Bull in the constructors title last year, they still
Yep.
finished second in the championship. And
That's
I
exactly what I'm talking about, right?
like so like again, what they can do or what the FIA can do here is a public reprimand, which is nothing,
Hmm.
a deduction of constructors points, a deduction of drivers points, a suspension from one or more stages of a competition or competitions, presumably looking forward, limitations on ability to conduct aerodynamic or other testing, and a reduction of cost cap. Of the things that you said, though, I strongly disagree that, and I agree that yes, the team should be punished, but equally the driver should be punished because ultimately they're driving in a piece of equipment that presumably has been enhanced and invested in other ways that other teams have it. That if I'm a Lewis
Sure.
Hamilton or I'm a Sebastian Vettel or I'm a Charles Leclerc, if I know my closest competitor has a car that had an extra 200 or 300 or $500,000 of investment, I'm going to be pretty choked. And why should that
Hmm.
driver keep theirs or their driver's points despite work driving what's effectively an illegal car? Again, maybe they didn't intend to cheat, but if they weren't managing the cost cap effectively and they invested too much money in that car, isn't that an illegal car? Like, and again, I don't have the
Yeah,
answers, and
totally.
I don't believe
Totally.
there's a conspiracy here. But I think the financial regulations are far too ambiguous. And again, I'm not pointing at the FIA. Everybody signed up. Everybody agreed to this. But what I don't like is the fact that it was bumped from Wednesday to Monday. Sure, obviously, give the give the Japanese Grand Prix a runway. Don't upset the organizers. Don't upset the vibe of the weekend. But to come out Monday and say,
Hmm.
actually, you know what? Despite the statement last week, Red Bull did in fact breach the cost cap. We're not going to tell you how much, and we're not going to give you a timeline for the punishment or how it's going to be adjudicated or who's going to adjudicate it or when it's going to be adjudicated. It's a little bit frustrating. And it just when it feels like we were moving on from 2021 because it took a very long time after that season finale for us to move by. And it took 3 months for the FIA to conduct an
Yeah.
investigation, which really didn't reveal a lot. Here we are again in October of 2022, still talking about the 2021 campaign. And to me, again, I love the cost cap. I'm so happy it's here. If we could have 5 or 6 teams battling for a championship every year, that's amazing. If the valuation of teams increase, that's awesome because it means that more people are interested in the sport. You have more manufacturers looking to join. You have more OEMs producing engines. All of these are good things, but the punishment has to have significant teeth. And I
Hmm.
don't know that the punishment is going to be excised in such a way. And if it's not, and they did overspend in a meaningful way, if they overspent by, and reportedly between $1 and $2 million, if they overspent by $1 or $2 million, and I'm any other team on the grid, I'm going to be furious. And again, this isn't a kind of a rant against Red Bull. This would apply to any team. If Mercedes overspent by $2 million, I would be making the exact same statement. And I know that sounds a little hollow because they didn't. It's just that
Yep.
this has got to have some teeth, man, because this is the backbone of the sport. The cost cap is now the backbone of Formula One.
Well, 100%, and I want to make sure that the punishment that the FI levies out is meaningful and it fits the crime, so to speak. Not to say that anything criminal happened, but I just wanted to be appropriate. But I also want to see transparency. Like for me, the worst case scenario is they come out with some wishy-washy reprimand for Red Bull, and it's just because reasons, because I
Yeah,
keep
I
going back
totally
to
agree.
like
Totally agree,
that
man.
whole Ferrari thing that you and I have talked about ad nauseum over the years, when they were judged to have like that illegal power unit at the end of 2018, and they have like this secret agreement with the FIA, and then what we all suspect is that they had this engine map imposed on them for 2019, which basically detuned the engine in that car, and that's why that Ferrari looked like it had no grunt to it that year. I mean, that still irks me today. I mean, it's like we're going to punish you, but we're not going to really tell the world what happened, and we're not really going to tell them like what the punishment is. We'll just leave everybody guessing. And I think that's an old school way of doing things, especially in Formula One. And I think that I know that the fans demand and deserve better than that, and I think that the sport demands and deserves better than that. So like I say, if they come out wishy-washy reprimand and because reasons, I'll be pretty blanking choked about it. Let's put it
Totally.
that way. Yeah.
Martin Brundle, I'll just quote him real quick in the skysports.com article. He says, and I
Hmm.
quote, "What seems absolutely crazy to me is that a minor breach can be up to 5% overspend on the cost cap. That is $7 million. And we know that is a massive upgrade on a car, maybe even a B spec car for some teams. So that needs tightening up for
Great
starters,
point.
because what is the point in having 145 million and then having this 5% variant? Other teams are saying this gives you a head start into 2022. The car is carried over to 2023. So this is a big advantage. It's not, it appears, the great crime we were told, but now we wait other news. So I very much agree with that comment too. That yeah. Okay. I think I'm done with this subject, man. I think I'm done with the subject. You guys did a great podcast. We'll obviously revisit it as news comes out, but I think it's a little bit frustrating. I want to be clear that we shouldn't be throwing flammable material at the FIA here, because the rules were agreed upon by everybody. They weren't
Oh yeah.
sprung
Yeah.
upon us in the last week, that the teams, the FIA, Liberty, everybody signed up to those. So if there's frustration with the ambiguity of the financial regulations, well, that's on everybody involved, not just the FIA. Now, how the FIA handles the investigation, the adjudication, and ultimately the penalty, if a penalty is to come, well, that's clearly on them.
Yeah, and the other thing that I keeps bouncing around inside my head is, come Monday morning when this was announced, I wonder what the conversation at that accounting firm was. I bet you something, guys, this was a big one. How did
Yeah.
this happen? How did we get here? We need to look at the, because you have to wonder, if Red Bull take a massive hit here, you got to think that there's going to be some sort of ramifications. If you see them going after that accounting firm, in one way or another, then it's just like, yeah, it's one thing to to do something naughty intentionally, but to have, like, I mean, like Toto says, there's nothing minor about a minor overspend like that. We're talking billions and millions and millions of dollars. This is, like, how did they, if they brought somebody in to help manage this thing, like, how did it get to that point? And that's what I, really blows my mind the
My
most.
wife, by the way, is on the stairs mouthing something at me because she's been listening to our conversation as we're sitting here recording this podcast. And her point is a good one as well, which is,
Yep.
if I'm a team and I'm
Yep.
in a situation, and we see this in team sports sometime, but if I'm in a team and we have a great start to the season and a couple of big upgrades that might be over the cap could push us into title contention, but I know there's no risk of disqualification for the current championship, but maybe I risk some aerodynamic access the next few years. Maybe there's a fine. Maybe we lose some constructors' points. But ultimately, if I'm in a position to win a championship, but I can spend $500,000 over to secure a driver's title, and I'll deal with that financial penalty later, I'm probably going to do that, because how often am I going to be in a position to win a championship? And if the cost is that I'm going to suffer a penalty next year, or I'm going to suffer a little bit of lost time in the wind tunnel, or there's going to
Hmm.
be some penalties around my future cost cap, that's something that I'm probably going to sign up for. So the penalty here needs to be a penalty that impacts them in the future. And again, them being any team, the penalty needs to impact them in the present and the future. And there needs to be a cost on the past as well. Because whenever we're
Yep.
talking about
Yep.
a cost cap certificate of compliance, we're talking about the prior year. And if I overspent and I won a championship, that's probably not enough that they get dinged this year, or they get a reduction in next year's cost cap. Like, what is the disincentive to somebody spending in one specific year to push them over the top to win a championship? So my wife and I don't agree on a lot of things, but that's certainly one that I definitely agree with.
So I'm going to take that take, and I'm going to twist it a little bit now, because you've given me a little bit of ammo here. I think that's a really great take, and a really good angle. So let's kind of like unpack that a little bit. I know you said you were done with this, but now you've
No,
given me
10 minutes later, we're
some
still going.
fresh
This is
ammo
great.
here. So, but I mean, in that scenario, is it not a little bit like playing Russian roulette? I mean, this is going to be me purely speculating here. But what if the FIA comes back in a couple of weeks and say, okay, this is the scenario. Okay, we're going to let Max Verstappen keep his championship. He's going to be driver's champion after 2022, but we're going to disqualify you as a constructor from the 2022 World Championship. Could you imagine that? And could you imagine just the fury and the amount of upset people, not only in Milton Keynes, but the people in Tokyo that just reworked this whole thing, sponsorship deal, to get those Honda badges back onto those engines, onto the side of that car, because Red Bull's running away with this thing, and it's powered by a Honda power unit that has a Red Bull powertrains badge on the side of it, and then they reworked that. Now it's not going to happen. I mean, that would be that would be just a huge nightmare. I mean, who's to say if they would go that far and exclude them from the championship this year? But like you say, when you go down all that list, I mean, it's a different Rubik's cube of combinations of things that they can do. Like you say, they can deduct points, they can be disqualified from championships or portions of championships, both team and drivers. So I don't know, that's just one thing that popped into my mind. I was just thinking, well,
Yeah.
maybe that was another part of the reason that they offset that announcement, which we really expected to drop, first about 10 days ago, then about a week ago, and then it got delayed another couple of days until after the Grand Prix. And then that kind of popped into my mind when you were going through that scenario.
So maybe what I should have done when I was reading out those sanctions is completed steps 2 and step 3. So I'll read these in full this time. A deduction of constructors championships of points awarded for the championship that took place within the reporting period of the breach. So they could only take constructors points off of them for 2021. And for the drivers
Okay.
one, deduction of drivers championship points awarded for the championship that took place again within the reporting period of the breach. So they couldn't take any constructors or drivers points off of them for 2022
For
or
this year. Okay.
2023. They can
Makes
only
sense.
take them off for that reporting period. So and that's where maybe I get a little bit confused, because part of the lack of clarity here is suspension, and another one, suspension for one or more stages of a competition or
Mm-hmm.
competitions, excluding for the avoidance of doubt the race itself. Again, would that be last year? Would you disqualify them from certain races last year, or would you disqualify them from certain races this year? And then limitations on ability to conduct aerodynamic or other testing, and or a reduction of the cost cap. Well, presumably that would have to be in the future. So it is a little bit, and this is where I get frustrated a little bit with the ambiguity of these
Mm-hmm.
regulations. Like, so if we're going to take points off them, it has to be during the previous campaign, so the campaign during the reporting period. But if we're going to suspend them from one or more stages of a competition, so that could be qualifying, that could be a Grand
Yeah.
Prix. It's not clear when that would be, whether it's in the past tense, future tense, present tense. And then the limitations on ability to conduct aerodynamic, well, the presumption there is that would be the future state. And again, a reduction of the cost cap would be for a future season as well. So it's very strange, very strangely worded. And again, I'm not putting the FIA in blast to everybody at home. I'm just
Yeah.
calling out that as I read this, I love nothing more than to sit down in bed with a cup of hot coffee, not hot coffee. I've never drunk coffee in my life, with a cup of hot cocoa and read a terms and conditions booklet. Like, I actually really enjoy that, but these aren't abundantly clear to me. And I think it leaves a lot to interpretation, which is why, to your earlier point, I think
Yeah.
we're going to get an empty, hollow penalty eventually.
Okay, so obviously I completely misunderstood the way that they could apply that penalty. So obviously it won't apply to anything that they could do this year, but if it refers to last year, it kind of makes you wonder, could they timestamp it to a certain date as to when they
Yeah,
exceeded the cost cap, and then
great point.
just like deduct any points? So say they went over the cost cap by July 1st, for example. So they were over their $145 million spend, and then they kept spending beyond that from July 1st, until the end of the year, the end of that championship. Then could they say, well, we're going to deduct everything beyond that point in time? I don't know if they have the ability to do that, to actually timestamp it. But that would be interesting, because they, like you say, if they took away 250 points from the constructors championship, they'd still finish second, in the constructors in 2021. So that doesn't really have any teeth into it, unless they actually drop multiple spots through the constructors championship, and they start
But
forfeiting all that money, that championship money, right? Prize money.
if
Sorry, go ahead.
they took 9 points off of Max, he loses his title. So it's interesting. Like, if
Yes.
they could come out and say, look, the penalty is we are going to take 10 points off of the drivers championship last year and 100 points off the constructors championship. For most teams, that's irrelevant. Well, maybe not the constructors, because that could have a meaningful impact to their prize money. But 10 points from a driver is pretty insignificant, but it would cost them the
Hmm.
championship. It would actually cost them the championship, which is
Yeah.
based on these regulations. A deduction of constructors championship points, a deduction of drivers championship points is absolutely something that they could deliver. And I'm not necessarily advocating for it. I'm just saying that
No.
would be the nuclear option here.
Yeah, well, exactly right. I mean, you'll have, like Team LH will say, well, justice finally been served. I mean, that wasn't
Right.
Max's title to begin with. And then, of course, you'll have all of Max's fans furious that, it was his, he won the race fair and square on that day. It was just the
And that F1
circumstances that
and
the way that
Liberty
they
are out to get
decided.
him, blah, blah. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, but I mean, the whole thing is you go back to the whole thing is he won the race fair and square. It's just the circumstances that race was concluded the way that Michael Massey decided to run those last couple of laps. That was nothing to do with Max had no influence out of that. He just raced those last couple of laps. So how's that really justice? Is like, does do two wrongs make a right, or I guess three rights make a left? But you know what I mean. It just to me that would seem to be the worst way to. I mean, like I say, some people would be obviously over the moon that justice was finally served and Lewis was awarded the title that he so properly deserved to win in 2021. And then other people would be saying, like, well, why are you making doing this because a contentiously decided championship has just become even more of a joke and everything like that. So there's no easy way. Like I say, I would be interested if they could actually timestamp it and deduct points
Yeah.
from that point forward, or just say, you know what, we're dropping you 5 places down in the constructors. Just we're just gonna just drop you straight down, and too bad, so sad, and we're gonna reduce your cost cap for next year or the year after, whatever it is, by 5 or 10%. And well, if you don't like it, well, too bad, you guys were over. Now you got to deal with the consequences.
Totally. I
So
completely agree with everything that you're saying. And
yeah.
again, my final point on this is going to be the regulations themselves are just too ambiguous. They're too loose. They leave too much to interpretation. And like I said, a public
Yeah.
reprimand is nothing. It's words on a piece of paper and
It
everybody moves
it
on. But a
it would be
deduction of driver's
ridiculous.
points could cost them a championship and the hundreds of
Hmm.
millions of dollars of financial windfall that comes with that, not to mention the
Yep.
stain that would be on the legacy of that organization. So if we're going to have tiers, if we're going to choose to have tiers of penalty based on how you exceed or how much you exceed the cost cap, it just has to be abundantly clear that if you overspend between $0 and $1 million, you're going to lose 50 drivers points and you're going to lose 100 championship points. If you spend 2 to 4 million, you're going to lose all of your drivers points and all of your constructors points. And three, if
Yep.
you spend more than 4 million, you're disqualified and you get a fine of $100 million. Like, it has to be crystal clear, because you make
Yep.
a great point that no matter what the outcome here is, and maybe they negotiate an outcome through the ABA, but if they do apply a penalty here, you're going to have one side of the paddock that's going to be screaming. They're going to be screaming that everything's always tilted in favor of Mercedes, and that Mercedes wouldn't have had this type of penalty. And then if it goes the other direction, you're going to have the other half of the fan base and the
Hmm.
other half of the paddock screaming that that's not appropriate. And again, this is going to happen. Nobody's going to be happy with the outcome of this, and it's going to be a surprise to all of us because they're just so ambiguous.
I'll let all the other teams, scream as much as they want, as long as Ferrari take a back seat to this, because out of everyone, I feel that they should not be making too much noise, because like I say, that whole engine thing that they had a couple of years ago, although it's slightly different situation than this, they obviously found a way to circumvent the rules and they got punished for it. So if they were to be the ones that kind of were leading the charge, I'd be like, yeah, guys, maybe you should take a back seat. Maybe some of the other teams run point on this one. You guys should maybe just kind of like come along for the ride, and just maybe don't speak unless spoken to. might be the way to go. But anyways, so I think we're almost an hour into this thing. Are we good to go on now? I
Yeah,
mean,
let's
we've
do. We
kind of
should
like,
also have a
all right.
break. We should probably have a break.
All right, we'll take a quick break here. I'll sneak a break in somewhere sneakily in the first 53 minutes of this show.
Podcast
So
magic.
yeah, exactly. I love what you can do in post production. Anyways, guys, we'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away. Okay, welcome back. Yes, we did mention Michael Schumacher somewhat really briefly, I guess, somewhere along the line. Yeah, we did. I think we referenced that at one point, or we should, because this next story has a tie into Michael Schumacher, pardon me, and that is his son Mick, who is currently without a drive or confirmed drive for 2023. But Haas team principal Gunther Steiner says that Mick Schumacher has what he calls the home advantage to keep his seat at Haas F1 for 2023. And that is in large part because the team has already been working with him for 2 years. And this would kind of make sense. And I know that Mick really hasn't delivered. There's a lot to live up to with that name. And you could make the comparison that when it comes to the Schumachers, he's more like Ralph rather than Michael. But I'd still think that compared to Ralph, Mick has a long way to go. And I don't want to take anything away from Ralph Schumacher, other than that he wasn't as good as his brother. But I mean, he was still a pretty good Formula One driver, managed to win some races. And if Mick is going to emulate either his uncle or his father, he's got a long way to go. But to kind of see him out or usher him out of that team at this point, for me, I don't know if that really would be justice for Mick. And, uh, I know maybe that sounds a little bit ironic. I mean, it is pro sports. It's a Shark Tank. We all know that. But I mean, last year, I mean, like we've said many times, Mark, you just got to wipe the slate clean. You look at how bad the car was, the fact they weren't developing that car. They were focusing more on 2022, pardon me, and then who his teammate was. Then you get Kevin Magnussen coming in at the 11th hour before the start of this season. The car is much improved. And then maybe you compare him to some other guys. I mean, look at the inconsistencies that we've seen with Yuki Tsunoda. Sure, Yuki's been able to score some more points, but let's face it, that Alpha Tauri the past 2 years, even though it's not the greatest car this year, the Alpha Tauri on paper and in reality has been a lot better than the Haas that Mick's been driving in the past couple of years. And the thing is too, when you look at the car that they've got this year, it's been a little bit frustrating because it's definitely shown some flashes of potential. Both Mick and Kevin Magnussen have had some pretty good showings at times. I mean, K-Mag had a great start to the season. They've managed to take home a pretty decent haul of points. But I don't know what your take is, Mark, but I'd certainly like to see Mick Schumacher stick at least a little while longer, maybe one more year, and then we can get a pretty good take on what where he's going with his career.
Taking a quick glance at the current World Drivers' Championship standings, Yuki Tsunoda currently sits in 17th place with 11 points. Mick Schumacher now is actually ahead of him in the World Drivers' Championship with 12 points. And I very much agree with you. And I don't necessarily agree that drivers deserve 2 or 3 years in Formula One to help illustrate whether they should be here, whether they shouldn't be here. I think it's probably abundantly clear in a single season whether they're qualified to be a Formula One driver. But as you and I've talked about so much, last year needs to be a total write-off. That was a team in disarray, in financial disarray, that was surrounded by distractions and had a 3-year-old car. And this year, it is to me his rookie season. And ultimately, Formula One is a cutthroat sport, and there's an abundance of qualified drivers on this planet that could probably step in and drive a Formula One car really effectively. But I also don't put a lot of stock in what Kevin Magnussen's done this year. I mean, ultimately, he had that thrilling fit start in Bahrain when he placed fifth, and he's had a couple of points finishes since then. He's only got 22 points this year, and this is a guy who has 100 Grand Prix of Formula One experience and should be running circles around Mick. And I think if things had broken a little bit differently for Mick this year, he could even be ahead of Kevin Magnussen, and then we certainly wouldn't be having these conversations. I would be curious to see where this goes. I have a soft spot for Mick only because I think he's a capable driver. I just don't think Haas is a team that does a particularly good job of nurturing its drivers or or nurturing its internal talent. I am also very suspect of the way that that
Hmm.
organization is run. And it's funny because there was a rumor that was circulating throughout F1 Twitter and F1 Reddit earlier today and earlier this week about the fact that Haas has in fact called a press conference for the US Grand Prix weekend, and it was speculated that they were going to be announcing their driver lineup for next year. Is Mick Schumacher in? Is Nico Hulkenberg in? And then it was later reported that no, in fact, while there is going to be a press conference, it's probably going to be about the fact that Haas might be signing on a new principal sponsor,
Mm.
who's reportedly going to be UPS. So in a sport that's been dominated by DHL as a primary
Hmm.
transport logistics partner, UPS could be signing up as a principal sponsor for Haas, which would inject some much needed financial security into that team. But I don't think Haas is in a lot of I don't know, in much of a panic to make this driver announcement. And I don't think Mick has any leverage whatsoever. And if he's offered a contract, he has to take it because I don't think he'd get one anywhere else.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, I think something that's kind of plays to Mick's benefit is the fact that Yuki just got re-upped at Alpha Tauri. And let's just say that I think when it comes to Yuki Tsunoda, I think that he's a good driver that's got potential, but I think there's been some professional focus issues with the Yuki. I mean, of course, he's a young driver as well, and I think that we got a little bit of a glimpse into what his mentality and where his head was in Drive to Survive, which was kind of interesting. So, I mean, I think that you know that he's need to buckle down and really focus more on his professional attitude to a certain degree. And like you say, I mean, Mick's currently a couple of points or just a single point ahead of him in the drivers championship. So I mean, if Yuki's been re-upped with his current team, then why would you not do the same at Haas? I mean, especially in this day and age where the whole pay driver thing doesn't really come into the equation. So let's wait and see what happens there. But actually hadn't heard that perhaps UPS would be announcing or coming on as a sponsor or partner with Haas F1. So I guess we'll have to see what happens at Coda next week. It's it's kind of funny. It feels kind of strange. Like I'm used to kind of having that race at this time of year, then going over to Mexico City afterwards, and then Brazil, and kind of like the sort of tail end of the schedule. It's just like on a personal note, I'm still kind of struggling to realize that we're actually there. I mean, the NHL has just started up. We're well into the NFL. I mean, we're the playoffs for Major League Baseball. I mean, the NBA is about to tip off here, literally just days away. So, I mean, it's just the sort of the stark reality that we're at that point of the year that, that my mind just isn't ready for yet. So, here you go. But talking about other drivers now, Franz Tost, the team principal at Toro Rosso. I was going to say Toro Rosso. Pardon me, I'm 2 years behind here. That's how far my mind is. Anyways, Franz Tost, team principal at AlphaTauri, believes that Nick de Vries, who's been recently announced as their a driver that's going to partner Yuki Tsunoda next year, will be very competitive from the first race. And what we saw of Nick at Imola, sorry, not at Imola, at Monza several weeks ago. I mean, that was impressive, driving a Williams, getting that car into the points. That was really, really good stuff. So I'm really excited to see what Nick de Vries will do in Formula One next year. Also moving along, Pedro de la Rosa is going to be a team ambassador for Aston Martin. So he was a test driver for the team way back in 1998 when it was actually, I mean, this is the kind of the interesting sort of evolution of Formula One teams as they change owners. So Pedro was a test driver for Aston Martin way back in the day when they were Jordan. And of course, they've changed owners several times until it was bought by Lawrence Stroll and his consortium a couple years ago and rebranded as Aston Martin last year. And then I guess this next story is no real surprise. So former team principal at Aston Martin slash Racing Point slash Force India, Otmar Safnauer, who is now the team principal at Alpine slash Renault. I'm just throwing the slashes in there just for the hell of it. Anyway, said that they did briefly consider reuniting with Danny Ricciardo. Ricciardo obviously not coming back to McLaren for 2023. And obviously, in the past week, they have confirmed that their driver lineup will be an all-French driver lineup for 2023 with Pierre Gasly alongside Esteban Ocon. And, I mean, you'd have to think that Danny Ricciardo's name obviously would have come up in the discussions, Mark. I mean, the question is internally, how far did they want to take that? And did they want to reunite? Because obviously, Ricardo drove for them for a couple of seasons there and moved over to McLaren for 2021. Now in his second year at McLaren, going to be his last. So, what do you think? How far do you think that they had this discussion, or do you think
Not
it was
far.
just like,
I don't think it
no,
went anywhere. I really don't. And like
really, really?
if you read the quote here, and I quote here from Snafnauer, he basically says, I'm going to paraphrase. He says, ultimately, we were looking for somebody that was young and fast, and Daniel doesn't fit either of that criteria. He's on the wrong side of
Mm,
30. He's rapidly approaching 35. He's one of the oldest drivers on the grid, and with the exception of that almost freak Monza result last year. I shouldn't say freak, that's a disservice, but with the exception of
yeah,
that
yeah.
unusual Monza result last year, he's been really poor. And I like Daniel. I'm just I feel like he's had every single opportunity to be successful over the last 2 years. And I'm not one of those guys that's going to make a bashful comment that like Daniel Ricciardo sucks and kind of wave my fists around. But the reality is, if you look at his performance over the last 2 years and you compare against his teammate crushes him everywhere, every sector of
Hmm.
every race pace, qualifying, free practice, everything everything that's measurable between the two of them, his teammate runs circles around him. And last year, I think McLaren ultimately were probably starting to lose a little bit of patience with him halfway through the season. And here we are 2 years into his gig with that team as a very competent team with a world class facility, world class personnel, a really solid car, and a solid chassis. And he's still getting slashed around by his teammate. Ultimately, I
Yeah.
think his time in Formula One has probably come and gone, and I don't think there was any possibility that he was going to go back to Alpine. And if I'm Otmar, how do I go to the board at Alpine Renault and say, hey, here's the move I'd like to make? I'd like, and
Hmm.
of course he would have to do that with Laurent Rossi, but how do I convince them to bring back a guy that left because he wanted to chase greener pastures and then has significantly diminished talent wise in the two subsequent years, when we could alternatively bring on a younger, potentially faster driver who's also French? It was never going to happen.
Yeah, 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 100%. But what I'm really interested in watching at Alpine next year is Pierre Gasly, because I think he's been a bit of an interesting study over the past couple of years. I mean, he comes into the sport, he starts driving for Toro Rosso, and then from there he gets promoted up to Red Bull, and then I mean, it just got off to the wrong start because he racks up the car in pre-season testing at Barcelona, and then that limits the amount of time that Max gets to do testing that year, and then he just gets off to his career at Red Bull on the wrong foot. They dump him after the summer break. Then he goes back to Toro Rosso. They promote Alex Albon. Alex looks like he's going to be like a really, really good driver. He does a really good second half of the season in the Red Bull. That he goes back the next year and struggles. Ultimately, they dump him, and then Gasly ends up back at Toro Rosso, which then becomes Alpha Tauri, and then he is where he is now. And I've just we've talked about it before, Mark, over the almost 2 years that we've been doing this podcast together, is that we've always speculated that Pierre Gasly, just for himself and professionally, would probably be better served if he could break out of that Red Bull environment. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it just seemed that he tried every single combination and he'd gone as far as he was going to go. And then you get Sergio comes into Red Bull. He has a bit of an apprenticeship there, and then as soon as he figured it out, I mean, Sergio's doing a great job for that team right now. You got Max crushing it. I mean, he's obviously on the top of his game. The car and the questions that we have about the car and like the overspend and everything, that's immaterial when it comes to like the discussion about the Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen, because they've just talent wise and consistency, they've just been, Max especially has been on another level this year. I mean, we can have the debate about the car all day long and the benefits that they may have gained from the potentially from an overspend, but just questioning the performance of the drivers themselves, I think, is without doubt. But certainly, I think Pierre Gasly will be a very, very fascinating driver to watch at Alpine in 2023. And this is a team that you and I have been watching for a good number of years, ever since they took over Lotus and then came back as Renault, and then they just haven't been able to really, I mean, that bell curve, like that development curve, it's been pretty flat. They just haven't been able to get it to the point that I think a lot of people wanted to see them take it. When you go back 15 years to those double world championships of Fernando Alonso in 2005 and 2006, I think that's what a lot of people were, I wouldn't say predicting, but we're expecting that that's the direction that they wanted to go, and obviously they haven't been able to take it there. Okay, next story: Formula Two race winner and race driver and Sauber Academy driver Theo Pourchaire will make his Formula One debut at Coda next week, driving in free practice. So this is really cool. So the young French driver has been a member of the Sauber Academy since 2019 and will get to take the wheel of Valtteri Bottas's car in FP1 next weekend. So that's pretty cool. Excuse me, I'm that was just I think I need a drink of water here, but you could forgive me if I get a little bit choked up about this next story, because Tim and I talked about it briefly on Monday, and that's just the story that the W Series has canceled their 3 remaining races this season to lack of funding. And that is certainly very, very disappointing. I mean, Tim and I talked about it. I know that, well, obviously you and I are big supporters and proponents of different formulas of motorsport, specifically the W Series and the opportunity that it gives to female drivers. Mark, I would be remiss if I didn't hand the mic back to you, because I know that this is a racing series that both you and I are very, very passionate about. So I want to get your take on this.
Right. And I'll let you grab a drink in the meantime. I think we've been
I'm
going
good.
at it
I'm
for
good
a
now.
couple of hours now. But right, it's ultimately disappointing. And I think that the biggest point of contention or point of frustration for me here is that there are businesses operating adjacent to the W Series that had every financial resource available to them to help pay the bills until the W Series could get through the season. We're talking about 3 races, and 3 races in North America, in the US and Mexico. The reality is it could easily have been covered by the FIA. It could have been paid for by Liberty, any other racing series, any other individual sponsor, any other partner of Formula One could have stepped up and helped to ensure that we could conclude this championship. But unfortunately, the championship has been wound up. Jamie Chadwick, shout out Jamie Chadwick, now has the triple. She has the hat trick. She's won all 3 championships in the history of the sport: 2019, 2021, and 2022. But alas, we won't have the final 3 races. And while I'm still not convinced that the W Series in and of itself will develop the first female F1 driver, I think that driver will probably come through F2 and certainly F3. I still think it serves an incredibly important function of illustrating and highlighting the opportunities that exist for women in motorsport, because women competing in motorsport in karting are a incredibly small fraction of the total number of people that get into those cars. And I think
Mhm.
if the W Series does anything, it helps promote to young women and young girls that there are opportunities for them to compete in motorsport. And if the W Series is their entry point and what attracts them to the sport and gets them involved with engineering or STEM research or karting, that's a good thing. And I think there's a ton of redeeming value in having a healthy, thriving W Series. And hopefully, in the absence of the series, we're going to see individual sponsors start to come through and identify talented young women and help fund their journey, even if it's not in the W Series, if it's Formula 3, Formula 4, Formula 2. That's ultimately what we need. But it's shocking that Formula One themselves, Liberty, which operate immediately adjacent to the W Series through so much of their calendar, couldn't step in and hand them $10 million to wrap up this championship. I think it's a stain on Formula One and Liberty as much as it is anyone else. And certainly they're not obligated to, but why would you not do it when your sport is absolutely flush with cash? I think it's
Mhm.
very, very, very disappointing.
Well, I mean, especially when you look at, globally over the past 2 years, how many people and entities and businesses have really struggled to get through the pandemic, right? And Formula One arguably has done pretty good. I mean, at a time when everything was shut down, we were still racing. I
Yeah,
mean,
great call.
it was a modified, shortened schedule, but they still managed to get a 17 race schedule in. And I think that it's disappointing at a point when they're raking in money hand over fist that they couldn't. Who knows if they were approached, but even just from the point of stepping up and saying, hey, you guys are having problems. What can we do to help? So disappointed to see potentially a lack of initiative on their side. Okay, a couple last stories before we wrap this one up. And I got one email I just want to. We already touched on it, but I just want to give a shout out to the emailer. Anyways, first of all, this is something you and I we speculated on last week, but confirmed that the Japanese Grand Prix exceeded an attendance of 200,000 spectators over the course of the weekend. That is the biggest crowd at Suzuka since 2012. So that was great to see, because you had mentioned it last week, Mark, that the Japanese Grand Prix had not been exceptionally well attended in recent years. So glad to see that the fans turned out in droves, especially when the weather was not the greatest at Suzuka the last weekend. And then the very last one, this is kind of cool. Apparently, they are going to redesign the track for the Singapore Grand Prix for next year. They're going to take out, was it turns 17 through 19, and that I think should make some well deserved or needed changes to the track. And like I say, that this is always a bit of a grind to get through this one. It's a long race. It's a physically demanding race for the drivers. But I've come to love Singapore over the years, and if they think that there's a way that they can improve this track and make it better, I'm all for it. What do you think?
Yeah, very much agree, man. And ultimately, this change is being made not because they want to spice it up or improve the racing. I think it's because of some local construction or development work that's going to be happening that's going to force this change. But ultimately, I don't mind a little bit of a change as well. I mean, this is a track that doesn't necessarily promote great racing. And I
Yep.
think taking out some of this technicality through those specific turns that you mentioned maybe won't necessarily be a bad thing.
Exactly, exactly. So I just want to dive into the mailbag here. I meant to pull this out when we had the discussion on the cost cap earlier, but I know that this is right up your alley. So this is from our good friend JJ in Houston, and JJ has to say, "Hi, Mark. All this talk about the cost cap recently got me thinking. What do the big teams that once spent tons of money before the $145 million cost cap do with excess funds under the new regulations? For example, if a rich team used to spend annually around $400 million before the 2022 season, what are they doing with the excess 255 million, assuming their fiscal resources are consistent with prior years? The championship may be decided, but your pod continues to deliver. Loving the content as always. Thanks, JJ from Houston." Well, thanks for the email, JJ. Always glad to hear from you. So, Mark, I'm going to throw this one to you. Since the business side of sports is always that's your thing, so take it away, sir.
Yeah, so shout out JJ. Thanks so much for reaching out. It's been a while, but we appreciate the kind words and appreciate the email. I think ultimately, and I spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I think one of the reasons that companies have been reluctant, and I shouldn't say companies as in sponsors, but companies as in investors and teams in Formula One have often been reluctant to come, and why we've seen so many big companies like BMW, Ford, Honda, um, Toyota leave the sport in droves in the past is because there's no financial predictability with the sport, meaning that if I'm Toyota and I have a Formula One team on the grid, I may need to spend $500 million to be competitive. And even if I'm competitive, it doesn't mean I'm going to win a championship or bring home a ton of prize money. And if I'm bringing home a ton of prize money anyways, it may not be enough to offset the amount of money that I'm spending. And all of this has meant that the financial unpredictability of the sport and the real challenge that it is to win titles and bring home a ton of constructors prize money means that the teams themselves have typically had very small valuations. And the benefit of the cost cap is you now guarantee all of the participants, all of the teams, that hey, you're not going to spend more than $145 million plus drivers and some of those other pieces. So say $200 million in total, meaning that if you earn in excess of $200 million when you factor in the constructors prize money and your sponsorships, Well, that's all gravy. That when you look at your financial statement at the end of the year, separate from financial regulations, but when you look at your financial balance sheet, everything that you earn beyond your costs is purely incremental income. It's all operating income. So ultimately, it's at the discretion of the organization as to how they want to distribute that money. And of course, they can't necessarily spend it back into the team because of the cost cap that you and I spoke so much about today. But the reality now is, because you've got these more predictable costs about around building and managing an F1 team, you've also got far more predictable income as well. And all of a sudden, if you know that I'm only ever going to spend $200 million a year in with the cost cap and the drivers and my engines, et cetera, and I'm possibly going to be able to earn $400 or $500 million a year in total income when you talk about prize money and when you talk about sponsorships. Well, all of a sudden, this is a team that's making $150 million after corporate taxes. And all of a sudden, this is a team that's worth $1 billion on the open market because it's so financially profitable to be in this business. So ultimately, it's their money to spend as they please, and every team is going to spend that money in a different way because every team has a very, very different ownership structure. But yeah, ultimately, in a lot of cases, that's just going to be pure gravy for these teams.
I know a certain Formula One podcast that could definitely use a financial injection to take it to the next level. I'm just saying. I mean, $255 million, even 1% would be, even 0.1% would make a
We'll
big
take
difference to.
$255 flat. We'll take $255.
Yeah, that'll pay the bills for a month. So there you go. Anyways, well, I think Mark, that's a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thank you to JJ for the email. Thank you to Connie, Rocky, Daniel, and everybody else that was watching the live stream on YouTube tonight. Thank you for the comments in there as well. Connie made a good point. She said they should find Red Bull and take the proceeds from the fine and use it to fund the W Series. So there you go. I love it. Creative ways to move money around in Formula One. So before we go, Mark, I know you had one little announcement that you like to make it this week every time, and so I'll let you do that.
A challenge for everybody listening at home.
There you go.
We currently have 99 reviews on Apple Podcasts. Would you like to be the one that pushes us over the edge to get us that century mark? If you would like, jump onto Apple Podcasts, give us a rating and a review. It means the world to both of us. If you don't use Apple software, jump onto Spotify, give us a rating there. It means as much as a review does on Apple Podcasts. I assure you of that. So if you've got a couple of minutes and you'd like to bless us, please do.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for listening to the show this week. Thank you to everybody that took the time to join the live stream. And that's it. That's a wrap for this week. If you want to get in touch, Twitter's the best way. We're at ScooteryF1Pod. Send us an email at ScooteryF1Pod@gmail.com. And no race this weekend, but we'll be back with the show on Monday. Got some things we want to talk about then. So have a great weekend, guys. All the best. We'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.